Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe. We are very happy to have you with us today, and as always, this podcast is specially created for people who want to improve their English listening skills while also learning about important global topics in a calm, clear, and educational way, because we believe that learning English becomes more effective and more interesting when it is connected to real events that shape the world we live in.
That is absolutely right, Adam. Many English learners feel confident when they listen to simple conversations, but they feel confused or uncomfortable when they hear international news or geopolitical discussions in English because the language often sounds formal, serious, and complex. So in this podcast, our goal is to slow everything down, explain each idea step by step, and help our listeners understand how global topics are discussed in real English.
Today's topic may surprise some listeners because we are not talking about a large country with a huge population or a famous capital city, but instead we are focusing on Greenland, a vast island covered mostly by ice, which for many years was rarely mentioned in daily news, yet in the 21st century, Greenland has become a place that global powers, researchers, and policymakers are paying close attention to.
Yes, and this is exactly what makes today's episode so interesting for English learners. Because Greenland shows us how geography, location, and natural conditions can suddenly become very important in global discussions, especially when climate change, international trade, and global security are changing the way countries think about the future.
When you look at a world map, Greenland is located between North America and Europe, stretching deep into the Arctic region, and this position may seem distant or empty at first glance, but in modern geopolitics, location is not only about population or cities, it is about access, routes, technology, and strategic connections that can influence how countries communicate, trade, and protect their interests.
For English learners, this is also a very good moment to notice how the word strategic is used in global discussions, because it does not always mean military action or conflict, but often refers to long-term planning, geographic advantage, economic importance, and cooperation between countries in a changing world, which is exactly how we will use the word in today's discussion.
In recent years, Greenland has appeared more frequently in international headlines, academic studies, and political conversations, not because of sudden conflict, but because melting Arctic ice, new shipping possibilities, scientific research, and global communication systems have increased the importance of the Arctic region as a whole, and Greenland sits at the center of many of these developments.
That is an important point to clarify early, Adam, especially for learners who may worry when they hear strong language in global news, because our discussion today is not about fear, conflict, or dramatic predictions, but about understanding why global attention shifts over time and how geography can quietly shape global priorities without loud headlines or urgent breaking news.
Before we move further, let us clearly explain one very important thing for our listeners, which is that this podcast is purely educational, neutral, and designed to help you understand English as it is used in serious global discussions without promoting any political position, supporting any government, or encouraging any form of conflict, because our purpose is learning, understanding, and language development.
Exactly, and this is why the English Globe focuses on explanation rather than opinion. Because when you understand how global topics are explained in English, you become more confident as a listener, and you also learn useful sentence patterns, formal vocabulary, and clear ways of expressing complex ideas, which are very helpful for exams, professional communication, and advanced conversations.
Another reason why Greenland is a perfect topic for English learners is that it allows us to practice describing geography, explaining cause and effect, and discussing global trends in a structured way, because we can talk about location, climate, resources, and international interest using clear language that appears very often in documentaries, news reports, and academic discussions.
As you listen today, we encourage you to pay attention to how long sentences are built carefully, using connecting words such as because, however, as a result. And for this reason, since these connectors help speakers explain complicated ideas slowly and logically, and learning to recognize them will greatly improve your listening and speaking skills.
In the 21st century, global power is not only shaped by armies or economies, but also by science, environment, communication systems, and geography. And Greenland is a clear example of how a place that once seemed remote can become globally significant when the world changes around it.
And from a learning perspective, this shows why following global topics in English is so valuable, because the language you hear reflects how experts explain change, uncertainty, and long-term thinking, which is very different from casual conversation, but extremely useful for learners who want to reach a higher level of understanding.
Throughout this episode, we will guide you carefully through Greenland's geographic position, its role in the Arctic, and the reasons why different countries and organizations consider it important today, always using simple explanations, clear vocabulary, and a calm tone, so that even listeners with basic to intermediate English can follow comfortably.
By the end of this podcast, you will not only have a clearer understanding of why Greenland matters in modern geopolitics, but you will also feel more confident listening to international discussions in English, which is one of the most powerful ways to grow as an English learner in today's connected world.
Now that we have introduced today's topic and clearly explained our educational purpose, we are ready to move forward together. And in the next part of our discussion, we will begin by looking more closely at where Greenland is located and why its position between continents and within the Arctic region plays such an important role in global thinking today.
So stay focused, listen calmly, and remember that every minute you spend listening to real, well-explained English is an important step forward in your learning journey. And we are very happy to take this journey with you here on the English Globe.
To truly understand why Greenland matters so much in today's world, we first need to slow down and clearly understand where Greenland is located and what kind of place it is. Because geography is not just about memorizing maps or names, but about understanding how location, distance, and natural conditions quietly influence global decisions over long periods of time.
That is a very important starting point, Adam, because many English learners may have heard the name Greenland before, but they might not clearly imagine where it is on the world map or why its location is considered so special compared to other regions.
Greenland is the largest island in the world, and this fact alone often surprises people, because even though Australia is larger, it is considered a continent, while Greenland holds the title of the largest island, covering a massive area that is more than 2 million square kilometers, most of which is covered by ice, glaciers, and snow for much of the year.
So, when we say Greenland is large, we are not exaggerating at all, because its size means it occupies a huge physical space on the planet, even though its population is very small, which already shows English learners an interesting contrast between land size and population size in geography discussions.
If we look at Greenland's position on the globe, we can see that it sits between three very important areas: the Arctic Ocean to the north, the Atlantic Ocean to the east and south, and North America to the west, which places Greenland in a unique position that connects major regions rather than separating them.
This is a good moment to pause and clarify something for learners, because when we say Greenland is between these areas, we mean that it is geographically close to North America, especially Canada, while also being closely connected to Europe through the Atlantic region, and at the same time reaching deep into the Arctic zone.
Exactly. And this central position means that Greenland acts almost like a bridge between continents, even though it is not a place where people travel easily, because planes, satellites, shipping routes, and communication systems often pass near or over Greenland due to its location at high northern latitudes.
For English learners, it is helpful to notice how we use phrases like acts like a bridge or connects regions, because in geography and geopolitics, these expressions are often used to explain importance without talking about physical movement of people.
Another key point about Greenland's geography is that it is located mostly within the Arctic Circle, which means it experiences extreme natural conditions, such as very long winters, very cold temperatures, and long periods of darkness or daylight depending on the season, making it a challenging environment for large populations.
And this helps explain why Greenland was not seen as very important in the past. Because when technology was limited and travel was slow, regions with harsh climates were often considered isolated, distant, and difficult to use for trade, communication, or strategic planning.
However, geography does not change, but the world around it does, and today, Arctic geography matters much more than it did before, because modern technology, climate change, and global connectivity have reduced distance and increased the value of regions that were once ignored or overlooked.
This is an important learning idea, Adam, because it shows learners that geography itself is neutral, but human activity, technology, and global needs can change how geography is interpreted and used over time.
In the past, thick ice made the Arctic region difficult to access, and long sea routes around continents were the main paths for global trade. But as Arctic ice patterns change and navigation technology improves, new northern routes are being studied and discussed, making Greenland's nearby waters more relevant than ever before.
For learners, this is also a good example of cause and effect in English, because we can clearly see that changes in climate and technology cause changes in how countries think about routes, access, and strategic planning.
Greenland's coastline is extremely long and complex, filled with fjords and icy waters, which gives it access to important ocean areas while also making it a natural observation point for scientific research, weather monitoring, and environmental studies that affect the entire Northern Hemisphere.
So, when experts talk about Greenland, they are not only talking about politics or strategy, but also about science, climate observation, and long-term global understanding, which is something English learners often hear in documentaries and academic programs.
Another reason why Greenland's geography shapes power is its distance from major global capitals, because it is far enough to provide strategic depth, but close enough to connect North America and Europe through air and communication routes, which has become increasingly important in a world that depends on fast information exchange.
This is a great place to remind listeners that words like strategic depth or global routes do not always mean conflict, but often refer to planning, protection, and efficiency, which are common themes in neutral and educational discussions.
It is also important to understand that Greenland is surrounded by water, which historically limited access, but today makes it part of global ocean systems that influence weather patterns, sea levels, and environmental balance across many countries.
For English learners, this shows how one geographic feature, like being an island, can be discussed in many ways, including environmental, economic, and strategic contexts, depending on the focus of the conversation.
When we combine Greenland's massive size, its Arctic location, and its position between major oceans and continents, we begin to see why geography alone can create long-term importance, even before we talk about politics, resources, or international relations.
And to paraphrase that in simpler language for our listeners, Greenland matters because it is big, it is located in a very important place on the map, and it sits in a region that the world is paying more attention to than ever before.
This foundational understanding of Greenland's geography will help you follow the rest of our discussion more easily, because every topic we explore later, whether it is climate, cooperation, or global interest, connects back to where Greenland is and how it fits into the world.
So as you listen, try to picture Greenland on the map in your mind, between North America and Europe, reaching into the Arctic, surrounded by oceans. And remember that geography is often the quiet starting point of global stories.
With this clear picture of Greenland's location, and geographic importance, we are now ready to move forward. And in the next section, we will explore Greenland's political status and its relationship with Denmark, using the same slow, clear, and learner-friendly English.
Stay focused, keep listening calmly, and remember that understanding geography in English is not just about learning facts, but about learning how the world is explained through language here on the English globe.
To understand Greenland's role in today's world, we now need to carefully and calmly explore its political status, because geography explains where Greenland is, but politics explains how decisions are made, who has authority, and how Greenland interacts with other countries. And this understanding is essential for English learners who want to follow international news without confusion or misunderstanding, especially when different levels of government and responsibility are involved.
That is a very helpful way to introduce this topic, Adam, because when learners hear phrases like autonomous territory or self-rule, they often feel unsure about what these words really mean in practice. So our goal here should be to explain these terms slowly, clearly, and with simple examples, so listeners can understand the system without needing any background knowledge in politics or law.
Greenland is officially an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, which means that while it is not an independent country in the traditional sense, it also does not operate like a normal region fully controlled by another state, because autonomy gives Greenland the legal right to govern many of its own internal affairs while still remaining connected to Denmark in specific constitutional and international areas.
To put that into simpler language for our listeners, Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but it is not ruled day to day from Denmark, because Greenland has been given the power to manage many important areas of life on the island, which allows local leaders to make decisions that reflect the needs, culture, and priorities of the people who actually live there.
This system of self-rule developed gradually, and today Greenland has its own parliament and its own government, which are responsible for areas such as education, healthcare, environment, fisheries, and local economic development, meaning that many policies affecting daily life in Greenland are decided by Greenlandic representatives rather than by politicians in Denmark.
For English learners, it is useful to notice how we describe this system using careful language, because instead of saying Greenland is controlled or ruled, we use phrases like responsible for and manages, which reflect a neutral and factual tone that is very common in international reporting and helps avoid emotional or misleading interpretations.
Denmark, however, still plays an important role in certain key areas, including foreign policy, defense, and currency, which means that when Greenland interacts with other countries on the global stage, these interactions often involve coordination with Denmark, creating a shared responsibility that reflects the unique constitutional relationship between the two.
This shared responsibility can sound complicated, but we can simplify it by saying that Greenland focuses mainly on internal matters, while Denmark represents the kingdom as a whole in many international and security-related discussions, which is why Greenland's political status is often described as autonomous but not independent.
Greenland's self-rule arrangement is especially important in geopolitics, because as global interest in the Arctic increases, questions naturally arise about who has the authority to make decisions related to cooperation, agreements, research access, and long-term planning. And understanding Greenland's political framework helps explain how these decisions are approached legally and diplomatically.
From a learning perspective, this shows why political status matters so much in global discussions, because it determines who can sign agreements, who speaks in international forums, and how responsibilities are shared. And these are exactly the kinds of questions that appear in serious news articles, documentaries, and policy discussions in English.
Another important aspect of Greenland's political system is that it allows for future development and choice, because autonomy includes the legal possibility for Greenland to seek greater independence if its people choose to do so through democratic and lawful processes, which is often mentioned in academic discussions as an example of flexible governance.
For listeners, it is important to understand that when experts mention independence in this context, they are usually speaking about long-term options and legal pathways, not immediate political action. And recognizing this difference helps English learners avoid misunderstanding headlines or assuming urgency where there may be none.
Overall, Greenland's political status matters because it shapes how the island participates in global affairs, how it protects local interests, and how it balances cooperation with Denmark and engagement with the wider world, all while maintaining stability, legal clarity, and respect for international norms.
To summarize this in very clear terms for our listeners, Greenland governs many of its own affairs through self-rule, remains part of the Kingdom of Denmark for certain international matters, and this balanced political structure is one of the key reasons Greenland can play a meaningful and stable role in modern geopolitics.
With this understanding of Greenland's governance and political relationship with Denmark, we now have a strong foundation to move forward, because in the next section, we will explore why the Arctic region as a whole has become more important in the 21st century, building directly on the geographic and political ideas we have discussed so far.
So keep listening carefully, and remember that understanding political systems in English is not about memorizing complex terms, but about following clear explanations step by step, which is exactly what we aim to provide here on the English Globe.
To understand why Greenland has become so important in modern geopolitics, we must widen our view and look at the entire Arctic region. Because in the 21st century, the Arctic is no longer seen as a distant frozen space at the edge of the world, but as a dynamic region where environmental change, scientific research, global trade interests, and long-term strategic planning are coming together, making it a key area of attention for governments, researchers, and international organizations that are trying to understand how global systems are changing over time.
For English learners, Adam, this is a good moment to focus on the phrase climate change, because in global discussions, this term is often used to describe long-term changes in temperature, ice coverage, and weather patterns. And in the Arctic, these changes are happening faster than in many other regions, which is why melting ice has become one of the main reasons the Arctic is now discussed so frequently in international reports and educational programs.
As Arctic ice melts over long periods, areas that were once permanently covered become seasonally accessible. And while this is primarily discussed as an environmental concern, it also changes how countries think about movement, observation, research, and transportation, because ice conditions directly affect sea access, satellite monitoring, and the physical ability to operate in the region, which means geography that once limited activity now creates new possibilities that did not exist in the past.
This is where learners should pay attention to cause and effect language, because melting ice does not automatically mean opportunity, but it does lead to discussions about potential shipping routes, scientific missions, and economic planning. And in English, you will often hear expressions like, as a result, this leads to, or this has increased interest, which helps speakers explain how one change creates several new questions.
One of the most discussed developments related to Arctic change is the possibility of new shipping routes that could shorten travel distances between major markets in Asia, Europe, and North America. And while these routes are still complex and carefully regulated, their potential existence has already influenced long-term planning conversations among governments and companies that think in decades rather than years.
For listeners, it is important to understand that when experts talk about shipping routes in the Arctic, they are not describing simple or immediate changes, but carefully studied possibilities. And this careful language shows how international discussions often focus on planning, risk assessment, and cooperation, rather than sudden action, which is an important pattern in formal English communication.
Because of these environmental and logistical changes, global interest in the Arctic has increased steadily, with countries investing more in research stations, climate studies, mapping projects, and international cooperation frameworks, all of which are presented publicly as peaceful, scientific, and long-term efforts to understand the region rather than dominate it.
This is a good opportunity for learners to notice vocabulary such as research, cooperation, framework, and long-term, because these words appear frequently in educational and policy-based discussions, and understanding them helps listeners follow serious topics without feeling overwhelmed by unfamiliar language.
The Arctic is now part of global strategy discussions, not because of dramatic events, but because it connects environmental stability, global communication systems, trade planning, and scientific knowledge, and Greenland, due to its location and size, naturally becomes part of these conversations as a place where observation, coordination, and responsibility meet.
To explain this simply, the Arctic matters today because changes there affect the whole planet, and Greenland matters because it sits inside this changing region, which makes it an important reference point in discussions about climate, geography, and global planning, all of which are common topics in advanced English listening.
Another reason the Arctic has gained attention is that global systems, such as weather patterns and sea levels, are closely connected to what happens in polar regions, meaning that decisions made about research, protection, and cooperation in the Arctic can influence outcomes far beyond the region itself, affecting societies that are thousands of kilometers away.
For English learners, this shows how global news often connects distant places to everyday life, and learning to follow these connections in English helps listeners understand how experts explain complex relationships using calm, logical, and structured language, rather than emotional or dramatic expressions.
Overall, the Arctic in the 21st century represents a shift in global awareness, where regions once seen as remote are now understood as central to environmental understanding and future planning, and this shift explains why Greenland is increasingly mentioned whenever long-term global stability, scientific cooperation, and strategic geography are discussed together.
As we move forward, listeners should remember that understanding the Arctic is not about memorizing facts, but about recognizing patterns of explanation in English, where speakers carefully connect climate change, geography, and global interest into one clear narrative, which is exactly what we aim to help you practice here.
With this broader understanding of why the Arctic region has become so important in modern global thinking, we are now ready to look more closely at Greenland's economic and resource-related significance, which builds directly on the environmental and strategic trends we have discussed in this section.
So keep listening with focus and curiosity, because each section adds another layer to your understanding of both the world and the English language. And this combination is what makes learning through global topics so powerful here on the English globe.
When we talk about Greenland's growing importance in the modern world, we must now carefully turn our attention to its natural resources and economic role, because economics explains why interest becomes sustained over time, and in Greenland's case, this discussion must be handled calmly and factually, since the island contains valuable natural elements such as rare earth minerals, energy-related resources, and rich fishing areas, all of which are discussed today in a long-term, regulated, and responsibility-focused economic context, rather than in short-term or speculative terms.
For English learners, Adam, it is helpful to pause here and explain what we mean by natural resources, because this term refers to materials that come from nature and can be used to support human activity, such as minerals, fish, or energy sources. And in global discussions, these resources are usually explained alongside rules, agreements, and environmental responsibility, not as unlimited or freely available materials.
One of the most discussed resource categories connected to Greenland is rare earth minerals, which are a group of elements used in modern technologies such as smartphones, wind turbines, electric vehicles, and advanced communication systems. And while Greenland does not currently dominate this market, its geological potential has placed it into serious economic discussions focused on future supply diversity and long-term planning rather than immediate extraction.
To simplify this idea for listeners, rare earth minerals are important not because people see them every day, but because modern technology depends on them quietly in the background. And understanding this connection helps English learners follow news stories about technology, energy transition, and global supply chains more easily.
In addition to minerals, Greenland is also often mentioned in discussions about energy-related resources, particularly in academic and policy-focused conversations about long-term possibilities, where experts emphasize careful research, strict regulation, and environmental impact studies rather than fast development, showing how economic potential is balanced with responsibility in serious international dialogue.
This balance is an important concept in English learning because when experts talk about economic opportunities, they often use cautious language such as potential, assessment, or long-term consideration, and recognizing these words helps learners understand that the discussion is analytical, not promotional or speculative.
Fishing is another key economic activity in Greenland, and unlike minerals or energy resources, it already plays a central role in the local economy, because Greenland's surrounding waters support fish stocks that are carefully managed to provide income, employment, and food security, while also respecting sustainability rules agreed upon through scientific research and international cooperation.
For learners, this is a good example of how economics and environment are often discussed together in English, because words like sustainability, management, and regulation appear frequently when industries depend directly on natural ecosystems.
When we combine these economic elements, we can see that Greenland's resources matter, not because they promise quick profit, but because they are connected to long-term global trends such as clean energy development, technological advancement, and responsible food production, which are major themes in 21st-century economic planning.
In simpler terms, Greenland's economy is discussed in global forums because it connects local development with global needs. And this connection makes it a useful case study for English learners who want to understand how economists and policymakers explain the future using careful and structured language.
At the same time, Greenland faces clear economic challenges, including high costs of infrastructure, a small population, harsh natural conditions, and the need for skilled labor, which means that economic development must move slowly and thoughtfully, supported by education, international cooperation, and strong governance rather than rushed decisions.
This shows learners how challenges are described professionally in English, because instead of emotional language, experts list practical factors and constraints, helping listeners understand problems without exaggeration or fear-based storytelling.
Environmental responsibility is always part of the economic conversation about Greenland because the island's natural environment is both fragile and globally important, and for this reason economic discussions emphasize protection, research, and long-term balance, showing how modern economics increasingly includes environmental considerations as a core principle rather than an afterthought.
For English learners, this teaches an important lesson about modern vocabulary, because words like responsibility, balance, and impact are now essential parts of economic discussions, especially when talking about regions like the Arctic.
Overall, Greenland's natural resources and economic significance are best understood as part of a careful, regulated, and forward-looking system, where opportunities are discussed alongside limitations and responsibilities, creating a realistic and stable picture that helps explain why Greenland is economically relevant without relying on speculation or dramatic claims.
To summarize this clearly for our listeners, Greenland's economy matters because it connects natural resources, modern technology needs, local development, and environmental care. And understanding how these ideas are explained in English will help you follow global economic news with greater confidence.
With this economic foundation in mind, we are now ready to move forward to the next part of our discussion, where we will explore how Greenland fits into the interests of major global actors, building directly on the geographic, political, and economic ideas we have already discussed.
So keep listening carefully. And remember that learning economic English is not about numbers alone, but about understanding how ideas are explained calmly and responsibly, which is exactly what we practice here on the English Globe.
As we continue our discussion, it is now important to calmly explain why Greenland attracts attention from major global powers, because international interest does not appear suddenly or without reason. And in this case, it develops slowly through geography, science, cooperation, and long-term planning, which is why countries such as the United States, several European nations, and other global actors include Greenland in their strategic thinking, while publicly emphasizing stability, partnership, and responsible engagement.
For English learners, Adam, this is a very useful moment to focus on how the word interest is used in international relations, because it does not automatically mean control, conflict, or competition, but often refers to attention, cooperation, research involvement, or long-term planning. And understanding this softer meaning helps listeners avoid misunderstanding serious global discussions.
The United States has shown consistent interest in Greenland over many decades, mainly because of its geographic position in the North Atlantic and Arctic regions. And this interest has traditionally been expressed through scientific cooperation, communication infrastructure, and defense-related monitoring that is described publicly as protective, defensive, and based on existing agreements rather than expansion or confrontation.
To rephrase that more simply for learners, the United States pays attention to Greenland because it is located in a very important place on the map. And this attention usually appears in discussions about observation, cooperation, and long-term security planning, not in aggressive or emotional language, which is typical of official diplomatic communication.
European countries also have strong connections to Greenland, especially through Denmark, and this relationship places Greenland naturally within broader European discussions about Arctic research, climate policy, environmental protection, and regional cooperation, showing how shared values and legal frameworks guide involvement rather than competition for influence.
This is a good opportunity for learners to notice vocabulary such as framework, cooperation, and policy, because these words are commonly used in European and international contexts to describe organized, rule-based collaboration between governments and institutions.
Beyond the United States and Europe, other global actors also observe developments in the Arctic region with growing interest, mainly because Arctic stability affects global trade routes, environmental systems, and communication networks, and Greenland's location makes it a reference point in these broader conversations without positioning it as a center of rivalry.
For listeners, it is important to understand that global attention does not always mean direct involvement, because many countries follow Arctic developments through research programs, international forums, and scientific cooperation, which is why discussions often sound technical, careful, and neutral rather than dramatic.
When people hear about military presence in Greenland, it is important to explain this topic at a high and non-technical level, because such presence is generally described as limited, defensive, and focused on monitoring, communication, and early warning systems that contribute to regional stability rather than preparing for conflict.
For English learners, this shows how sensitive topics are discussed carefully in English, using calm language and avoiding emotional expressions, which helps maintain clarity and prevents misunderstanding, especially when listening to international news or official statements.
In modern international relations, Greenland is most often discussed as a place of strategic cooperation, where countries work together on research, safety, navigation, and environmental monitoring, reflecting a shared understanding that the Arctic requires collaboration due to its size, conditions, and global impact.
This cooperative language is very important for learners to recognize, because words like partnership, coordination, and shared responsibility appear frequently in educational and diplomatic content, and they signal peaceful intentions rather than competition.
Stability is a key concept in all discussions involving Greenland and major global powers, because long-term planning in the Arctic depends on predictable rules, respect for existing agreements, and diplomatic dialogue that reduces uncertainty and supports peaceful interaction between countries.
To explain that simply, stability means keeping the situation calm, organized, and predictable, which allows countries to plan for the future without fear or confusion. And this concept appears often in English-language discussions about global regions.
Diplomacy plays a central role in maintaining this stability because communication, negotiation, and mutual understanding help ensure that Greenland remains a place where cooperation is prioritized and international norms are respected, even as global interest continues to grow.
For learners, diplomacy is an especially useful word to understand because it represents how countries talk to each other politely and carefully to solve problems, avoid misunderstandings, and work together, which is a common theme in global news and educational content.
Overall, Greenland's relationship with major global powers can best be understood as part of a broader system of cooperation, legal frameworks, and shared interests, where attention is managed through dialogue and responsibility rather than conflict or competition.
To summarize this clearly for our listeners, Greenland matters to major global powers because of its location and role in the Arctic. But this attention is expressed mainly through cooperation, research, and diplomacy, making it a valuable example for learning how international relations are discussed in calm and professional English.
With this understanding of Greenland's place in global relationships, we are now ready to move forward and explore how technology, security, and modern strategy connect to Greenland's role in the 21st century.
So keep listening with an open and focused mind, because learning how peaceful international cooperation is explained in English will greatly help you understand global news more confidently here on the English globe.
When we talk about security and strategy in the modern world, it is very important to explain these ideas carefully and calmly, because today, security is not only about physical borders or visible actions, but also about information, communication, and awareness, and Greenland becomes relevant in this context mainly because of its geographic location, which supports technological systems such as satellites, communication routes, and early warning networks that help countries understand what is happening in large areas of the world without creating fear or tension.
For English learners, Adam, this is a good moment to clarify that the word security in international discussions often means protection and awareness rather than danger or conflict, and when experts use this word, they are usually talking about systems that help countries stay informed and prepared, not about sudden or dramatic events, which is why the language used is often technical but calm.
Satellites play a major role in modern global systems, and because the Earth is round, satellites that pass over high northern latitudes can observe large parts of the planet, making regions like Greenland important reference points for tracking weather patterns, communication signals, and navigation data that support civilian, scientific, and safety-related activities around the world.
To explain that more simply, satellites work better when they have clear coverage of wide areas, and Greenland's location near the Arctic allows satellites to collect and send information efficiently, which is why you often hear Greenland mentioned in discussions about space technology and global monitoring systems.
Communication routes are another important part of modern strategy, because in today's connected world, information must travel quickly and reliably, and many long-distance communication paths, including air routes and data transmission systems, pass through or near Arctic regions, making Greenland an important point of connection rather than a place of isolation.
For learners, it is helpful to notice how we describe this without using emotional language, because words like connection, transmission, and reliability focus on function and efficiency, which is how serious discussions about technology are usually presented in English.
Early warning systems are often mentioned alongside Greenland, and these systems are designed to provide information as early as possible about environmental changes, space activity, or technical issues, allowing governments and organizations to respond calmly and responsibly, which supports stability rather than conflict.
This is a good example of abstract language becoming clearer, because early warning does not mean immediate danger, but simply early information. And understanding this difference helps English learners interpret international discussions accurately.
Location matters greatly in technology and defense planning, not because of aggression, but because physical position affects visibility, signal strength, and response time, and Greenland's position between major continents allows systems placed there to function efficiently within global networks.
To put this in very simple terms, Greenland's location helps technology work better by allowing information to move faster and cover larger areas, which is why experts often describe it as strategically useful without suggesting any form of conflict.
Modern strategy focuses on coordination, prevention, and understanding, and Greenland's role fits into this approach because it supports systems that aim to reduce uncertainty, improve communication, and support shared knowledge among countries that value cooperation.
For learners, this shows how modern strategy is explained in English using words like coordination, prevention, and awareness, which signal calm planning rather than dramatic action.
It is also important to emphasize that discussions about technology and security related to Greenland are usually forward-looking and educational, focusing on maintaining reliable systems and understanding global changes rather than predicting specific events or creating fear.
This focus on understanding rather than prediction is very helpful for English learners because it encourages listening for explanation and reasoning instead of emotional reactions, which is a key skill for advanced listening.
Overall, Greenland's connection to security, technology, and modern strategy shows how geography supports peaceful systems that keep the world informed, connected, and stable. And understanding this helps listeners see strategic discussions as structured and logical rather than alarming.
To summarize this clearly, Greenland matters in modern strategy because it supports technology that helps countries communicate, observe, and understand the world better. And learning how these ideas are explained in English will strengthen your confidence when listening to serious global topics.
With this understanding of security and technology, we are now ready to move forward to explore the environmental and global responsibility aspects connected to Greenland, which build naturally on the themes of awareness and long-term planning we have discussed here.
So continue listening with focus and curiosity, and remember that learning abstract ideas in English becomes much easier when they are explained calmly and step by step here on the English globe.
When we shift our focus to climate change and environmental responsibility, it is essential to approach Greenland with calm, precise, and educational language, because the island's vast ice sheet is not only a defining geographic feature, but also a critical factor in global sea level regulation, long-term climate patterns, and scientific observation. And understanding this helps learners see why environmental stability is not just a local issue, but a topic that affects countries across the world, influencing agriculture, coastal safety, infrastructure planning, and international policy in subtle but measurable ways over decades.
For English learners, Adam, this is a perfect moment to notice how we describe environmental importance in neutral language, because words like critical factor, regulation, and observation explain significance without exaggeration, and phrases like subtle but measurable effects help listeners understand that climate change is serious but not dramatic in everyday conversation, which is the kind of careful, professional English often used in global news reports and scientific discussion.
Greenland's ice sheet contains roughly 10% of the world's fresh water, and its slow melting or movement has measurable effects on global sea levels, ocean currents, and regional climates. And this is why scientists, policymakers, and international organizations watch Greenland carefully, not as a site of immediate crisis, but as a long-term barometer for global environmental change, which also makes Greenland a central reference in conversations about sustainability, energy planning, and scientific cooperation among nations.
To clarify for learners, Adam, the word barometer here is used metaphorically to describe Greenland as a measure or indicator of global environmental health, meaning that scientists look at changes in the ice, temperature, and melting patterns to understand how the planet's systems are evolving, which is a very common style of explanation in professional English writing and news reporting.
Scientific research in Greenland is extensive and highly structured, with multiple international programs studying glaciers, ice cores, atmospheric conditions, and marine ecosystems. And the findings from these studies are often used to make long-term projections about sea level rise, climate stability, and environmental risk management, helping countries make informed decisions about adaptation strategies, international cooperation, and policies to reduce environmental impact in a careful and data-driven manner.
This is an important moment for English learners to note the sentence structure, Adam, because long sentences are built with connecting words such as and, which, helping, and about, showing how complex ideas can be presented clearly and logically. And learning these patterns will help listeners follow professional reports and academic presentations in English more comfortably.
Greenland's environment also has geopolitical implications, because stability or instability in Arctic ice affects maritime navigation, global ocean currents, fisheries, and climate-dependent agriculture, meaning that environmental change is closely connected to international planning, strategic decision-making, and global coordination. And this is why countries discuss Greenland not only as a geographic or political entity, but also as a critical environmental partner in global policy forums and scientific alliances.
To humanize this point for our listeners, Adam, it is helpful to imagine that changes in Greenland can affect people thousands of kilometers away, from farmers in Europe adjusting crops to coastal communities planning flood defenses, and understanding this connection helps English learners see that environmental language often links local observation to global consequences in calm and factual terms.
Global cooperation is a central theme in Greenland's environmental relevance because many countries, research institutions, and international organizations participate in joint programs to monitor ice sheet movement, ocean temperatures, and greenhouse gas emissions. And these cooperative efforts emphasize shared responsibility, long-term planning, and the idea that no single country can manage climate change alone, which is why diplomacy, agreements, and scientific collaboration are regularly mentioned in Arctic discussions.
For learners, this demonstrates how words like shared responsibility, cooperation, and long-term planning are often repeated in English to emphasize teamwork and collective action without suggesting blame or conflict, which is an important pattern to recognize in educational and neutral reporting.
It is also worth noting that Greenland's environmental significance is reflected in policy documents, international treaties, and scientific publications, which often describe the region as a natural laboratory for climate research, a key location for understanding rising sea levels, and a barometer for global environmental health, demonstrating how neutral, structured, and factual language can convey urgency without creating sensationalism or fear.
To make this clear for listeners, Adam, we can say that Greenland provides information, not warnings, meaning that scientists and policymakers use data from the island to plan responsibly. And this is a good example of how English used in international discussions often focuses on evidence, reasoning, and measured conclusions rather than dramatic predictions.
In addition, the Arctic region, including Greenland, reminds the world that environmental responsibility is a shared global duty because actions taken by one country, such as reducing emissions or protecting marine life, can have ripple effects that benefit multiple nations, and this perspective is frequently emphasized in global summits, research reports, and educational content to reinforce the idea that the planet's health requires cooperation and mutual awareness, rather than unilateral action or conflict.
For English learners, this section demonstrates how abstract concepts like responsibility, cooperation, and global duty can be explained in clear sentences, showing that even complex ideas can be communicated effectively through careful language, step-by-step explanations, and supportive examples, which is exactly what we aim to practice on the English globe.
Overall, Greenland's ice sheet, environmental systems, and scientific role make the island a central element in global conversations about climate change, and understanding this connection allows listeners to appreciate how environmental stability, responsible management, and international cooperation are discussed in professional English, forming a calm, evidence-based, and educational narrative rather than a sensational story designed to alarm audiences.
To summarize for our listeners, Greenland teaches us that geography, science, and responsibility are deeply connected, and learning how these ideas are presented in structured English will strengthen your ability to follow global news, understand environmental discussions, and participate in educational dialogues with confidence, which is a core goal of this podcast series.
With this foundation in climate, environment, and global responsibility, we are ready to move into our next section, which will explore Greenland's role in the broader geopolitical balance, combining environmental, economic, and strategic perspectives to give listeners a complete and neutral view of why this island matters so much today.
So continue listening attentively, focusing on the structured explanations, careful vocabulary, and clear reasoning, because this approach will enhance both your English comprehension and your understanding of real-world global issues, step by step, here on the English globe.
As we move into this section, it is important to take a step back and reflect on the larger lessons Greenland teaches us about modern geopolitics, because understanding international relations is not only about knowing facts or memorizing locations, but about seeing patterns where geography, climate, resources, and human decision-making intersect. And Greenland is a perfect example of how a relatively small region can influence strategic thinking, international cooperation, and long-term planning in ways that reach far beyond its borders, offering English learners a unique opportunity to observe how experts explain complex global topics in calm, structured, and accessible language.
That is right, Adam. And for learners, it is helpful to notice how we use words like intersect, influence, and strategic thinking, because these terms show how multiple factors come together. And in English, reflecting on big-picture ideas often involves linking causes, effects, and relationships in long, well-connected sentences, which is a skill that can improve both listening comprehension and analytical thinking.
Greenland's role illustrates that geography is not just about maps or physical features, but about how location determines accessibility, visibility, and connection to global systems, meaning that a region with few people and challenging conditions can still have a significant impact on international trade, scientific research, environmental observation, and strategic planning, which is why geopolitical discussions often begin with an analysis of place before moving on to politics, economics, or security.
To simplify this idea for learners, Adam, we can say that where a place is located matters a lot, because it affects who can reach it, what can be observed there, and how it connects to other important parts of the world. And noticing this connection helps learners understand why Greenland, despite being small and remote, appears regularly in global news and educational discussions.
Another lesson from Greenland is that climate change and environmental conditions are now inseparable from discussions of power and international strategy, because melting ice, shifting ecosystems, and scientific observation influence planning, policy, and coordination among nations, and by examining how experts integrate environmental data into strategic thinking, learners can see how 21st-century geopolitics often relies on knowledge, prediction, and shared responsibility rather than on military power alone.
This is an excellent point for learners to understand that modern geopolitics in English is often described using neutral, technical, and precise language, such as coordination, shared responsibility, and planning, which allows discussions to be educational and factual without being dramatic or fear-based, helping listeners build confidence in understanding international news reports.
Greenland also demonstrates that small regions can have global importance because influence is not determined only by population size or economic output, but by strategic location, natural resources, and international agreements, which is why countries pay attention to islands, poles, or specialized zones that might otherwise seem isolated, and why analysts describe these regions in neutral, informative, and educational terms to convey understanding rather than alarm.
For learners, this teaches an important lesson in English, that words like importance, strategic, and neutral appear frequently in professional analysis, and recognizing these patterns helps listeners follow news, research articles, and policy discussions more easily, especially when the content involves multiple countries and complex global issues.
Another key insight is that learning to think critically about world news is as important as learning the facts themselves, because Greenland encourages us to ask questions such as why countries cooperate, how geography influences decisions, and what long-term consequences may arise from environmental and economic changes, and using simple English to analyze these questions helps learners practice reasoning skills while improving vocabulary and comprehension in real-world contexts.
To make this clear for listeners, Adam, we can say that critical thinking means pausing to ask why something matters, how it connects to other events, and what lessons it teaches. And practicing this skill in English allows learners to understand not only global topics, but also the language used to explain them professionally, calmly, and logically.
Greenland also teaches that modern geopolitics combines multiple dimensions: political structures, economic resources, environmental conditions, and technological systems. And understanding these connections requires a holistic view, meaning that students and learners should practice seeing the world as an interrelated system, where one change in geography, climate, or policy can ripple across continents and influence decisions in distant capitals.
For learners, this highlights why long, well-structured sentences with linking words such as meaning that, because, where, and which are so important in English, because they help connect multiple ideas clearly, making it easier to follow complex topics like global strategy and environmental impact.
Finally, Greenland reminds us that knowledge, analysis, and careful observation are at the heart of modern global understanding, because decisions are rarely made in isolation, and the combination of local conditions, scientific research, and international cooperation shapes both policy and public awareness, offering a practical lesson for English learners who wish to engage with global issues thoughtfully, calmly, and confidently. Finally, Greenland reminds us that knowledge, analysis, and careful observation are at the heart of modern global understanding, because decisions are rarely made in isolation, and the combination of local conditions, scientific research, and international cooperation shapes both policy and public awareness, offering a practical lesson for English learners who wish to engage with global issues thoughtfully, calmly, and confidently.
To reinforce this for listeners, Adam, Greenland encourages learners to pay attention to reasoning, connections, and careful language, showing that even abstract topics like strategy, climate, and geopolitics can be explained clearly in English, and that listening, reflecting, and understanding patterns will strengthen both comprehension and confidence over time.
In summary, Greenland teaches us that small regions can influence the world, that geography, climate, and resources are intertwined with strategy, and that careful, structured analysis helps us understand complex topics without fear, creating an approach to global news that is both educational and learner-friendly.
And for learners, this is a moment to remember that thinking critically, noticing patterns, and following structured explanations will improve not only your English comprehension, but also your ability to understand world events calmly, confidently, and professionally, which is the core aim of every episode on the English Globe.
With these reflections in mind, we are now ready to conclude our discussion in the next section, where we will summarize the key ideas, highlight important lessons, and leave listeners with practical takeaways for learning English while exploring Greenland and its global significance.
So stay focused for the final section, because our goal is to reinforce understanding, strengthen learning confidence, and show clearly how global topics and English education can be combined in one informative and thoughtful podcast.
As we reach the conclusion of today's episode, it is important to calmly and carefully summarize the key ideas we have discussed, because revisiting each point helps learners understand how Greenland fits into the larger picture of 21st-century geopolitics, environmental awareness, and strategic planning, and ensures that the complex information we explored is absorbed in a structured and learner-friendly way, providing clarity on geography, political arrangements, natural resources, global cooperation, environmental responsibility, and modern strategy in a way that is calm, clear, and fully educational without exaggeration or sensational language.
For English learners, Adam, this is an excellent moment to notice how we are linking all the sections together, because understanding summary language, connectors, and transitions such as we discussed, it is important to, and ensures that, helps listeners follow long professional explanations in English. And it also gives confidence that even very complex topics can be understood step by step when the language is structured thoughtfully.
We began today by establishing Greenland's location and physical characteristics, carefully explaining how the island sits between the Arctic Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and North America and Europe, and why this geography matters for shipping routes, scientific observation, and strategic planning, demonstrating that a seemingly remote region can become central to global considerations when location, environment, and accessibility intersect, and emphasizing that understanding geography is a fundamental step for learners to grasp global news more accurately.
In simpler terms for learners, Adam, this means that knowing where a place is and what surrounds it helps you understand why countries care about it. And when you hear international news, focusing on geography first will allow you to understand subsequent political, economic, and environmental discussions more easily.
Next, we examined Greenland's political status, explaining its autonomy within the Kingdom of Denmark, the powers of its local government, and how self-rule works today, all while emphasizing that political arrangements in the Arctic are carefully structured to support stability, cooperation, and legal governance, which allows learners to understand how governance frameworks are described in English without invoking conflict or controversy, and how neutral, precise language is preferred in professional and educational discussions about international topics.
For learners, it is helpful to see how phrases like carefully structured, support stability, and neutral language are used to discuss governance calmly and factually, because recognizing these patterns helps you interpret political discussions in English with confidence and without misunderstanding the intent of the speaker or writer.
We also explored Greenland's economic significance, focusing on natural resources such as rare earth minerals, energy potential, and fisheries, and explained how these resources are valuable for technology, sustainable development, and long-term planning rather than short-term speculation, highlighting that modern economic discussions often balance opportunity with environmental responsibility, and showing learners how careful and precise language is used when discussing economics and global news.
To clarify, Adam, this teaches English learners to notice words like long-term planning, responsibility, and sustainable development, which are often repeated in professional reporting to emphasize thoughtful management and cooperative engagement rather than immediate or dramatic outcomes. and following these patterns improves comprehension of economic topics in global discussions.
Moving further, we addressed Greenland's role in international relations, explaining how countries such as the United States, European nations, and other global actors express interest in the region primarily through cooperation, research, and strategic planning rather than conflict, and how stability and diplomacy are prioritized, demonstrating that international attention is expressed in calm, legal, and structured language, which is crucial for English learners to recognize as they encounter diplomatic discussions in media or academic content.
For learners, this shows the value of words like cooperation, strategic planning, and diplomacy, which signal peaceful engagement and responsible discussion, helping listeners distinguish between neutral reporting and sensationalized narratives, and giving them confidence in following serious international news in English.
We then discussed Greenland's connection to technology and modern strategy, highlighting satellites, communication systems, early warning networks, and the importance of location for observation and coordination, always avoiding fear-based language and focusing on understanding systems rather than predicting events, which helps learners appreciate that strategy in English is often presented as calm, data-driven, and analytical rather than emotional or dramatic.
In simpler words for learners, Adam, Greenland is important for technology and monitoring, because it helps countries communicate, observe, and plan responsibly. And this is a good example of how abstract and complex ideas can be described clearly in English without using alarming words, making it easier to understand professional discussions.
Climate change and environmental responsibility were also central to our discussion, because Greenland's ice sheet influences global sea levels, regional climates, and long-term environmental stability, and because scientific research in the Arctic provides critical information that informs international planning, demonstrating to learners how environmental topics are integrated into geopolitics and economics using calm, neutral, and evidence-based language that emphasizes learning and global cooperation rather than fear.
For learners, this section reinforces the importance of understanding connections between environment, policy, and science, and noticing how phrases like long-term stability, evidence-based language, and global cooperation are repeated to communicate responsibility and clarity in English, which helps listeners follow educational discussions confidently.
Finally, we reflected on the broader lessons Greenland teaches about modern geopolitics. How small regions can have global importance, how geography, climate, and resources intersect with strategy, and how careful analysis, structured language, and critical thinking help learners interpret international news, which provides a practical model for understanding complex issues while practicing English at the same time.
To summarize this for our learners, Greenland shows us that understanding patterns, connecting causes and effects, and following structured explanations in English allows you to interpret global events calmly and confidently, while also improving your comprehension of advanced vocabulary, sentence structures, and professional language used in international discussions.
Before we finish, it is important to clearly remind our listeners that this podcast is entirely educational. We do not take sides in any political matter, nor do we promote any government, policy, or leader. The goal is to explain international events in a neutral, structured, and learner-friendly way so that you can improve your English listening, vocabulary, and comprehension while also gaining a balanced understanding of global topics.
And as a warm closing message for our learners, remember that every episode you listen to adds a step toward fluency, confidence, and deeper understanding of world events. And by focusing on structured explanations, calm reasoning, and clear language, you are training both your mind and your English skills at the same time.
Thank you for staying with us through this detailed discussion of Greenland, its geography, politics, resources, environmental significance, and role in modern geopolitics. We hope this episode has strengthened your English listening skills and helped you understand complex topics in a safe, calm, and educational way.
Keep practicing, stay curious, and remember that learning English through real-world global topics is a powerful way to build confidence and knowledge. And we look forward to continuing this journey with you in our next episode here on the English Globe.
So, dear listeners, until next time, stay attentive, keep reflecting, and continue exploring the world in English, because every new topic you learn will expand both your language skills and your understanding of the planet.
And always remember, learning English is a journey, and each step you take brings you closer to understanding not only the language, but also the fascinating world around you, one calm and thoughtful podcast at a time.